the miracle behind the phenomenon which is post-falls. Today, families benefit from a fairly well-established situation with a priory and 2 schools just around the corner. They have regular access to the sacraments and the liturgy. They can confide their children to Catholic teachers from kindergarten through 12th grade. But 50 years ago, fidelity to God was the object of a solitary, heroic choice made in pure faith. The choices that were made in 1974 by the mothers of our congregation, the choices of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and of a number of men and of lesser-known but equally courageous women, reflect a desire for fidelity in the strongest sense of the word. Their choices to remain faithful to what they had received merited all that today's generation now enjoys. Not to explain away the miracle, but to better appreciate the merciful design of God, I would like to present a brief history of our congregation and the founding of St. Dominic's School, in the hope that you will see the parallels between the choices made by the faithful of Immaculate Conception Church and the congregation of the Holy Name of Jesus. The origins of our congregation date from the tumultuous time after the French Revolution, a time of rebuilding what had been destroyed by the revolutionaries, who had confiscated church property, abolished religious vows, exiled priests and religious, or forced them into hiding, and guillotined the ones that they could find. All over France, existing religious communities were trying to pick up the pieces and reestablish their convents and schools, while new communities were being formed. It was from the very rubble of the French Revolution then that the first miracle of the founding of our congregation sprung. It was in 1801 in southern France that the Institute of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary was born. A diocesan priest of the city of Toulouse, Father Vincent, had just returned to his native France from Spain, where he had been exiled. In his diocese, he met a young woman, a former teaching sister, whom the revolution had expelled from her convent. Stripped of her habit and hunted by the revolutionaries, Rose de Sévérin had remained in hiding, seeking to keep her vocation alive by going incognito from house to house, teaching as many children as she could. Animated by the same faith and generosity as Father Vincent, Rose was quick to confide in him and ask for his help. Within 3 months, 3 more women joined in their work of the education and teaching of young girls. And under Father Vincent's direction, a new congregation was born, whose aim was to engrave the name of Jesus on the heart of every child. In spite of many obstacles and difficulties, the Institute of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary soon began to grow in vocations, in students, and in foundations. New schools were filled with boarding students from all classes of society throughout southern France. In order to preserve the vitality of this new institute and to give it support and guidance, the Superior General of the time, Mother Helen d'Aiguzon, conceived the idea of affiliating it to one of the great orders of the Church, whose spirituality would be very much like their own. Providence sent Mother Helen 2 Dominican fathers to make this desire a reality. Father Cocconier saw to the sisters' formation in the spirit of the Dominican order, that is, an apostolic spirit, a desire to give to others the fruit of one's contemplation. Mother soon obtained permission from the prior provincial, Father Cormier, who would later be Master General, to join the Dominican order. The affiliation ceremony was fixed for December 8th, 1885. Not long after, Pope Leo XIII would approve and recognize the Society of Sisters as the congregation of the Holy Name of Jesus, of the Third Order of St. Dominic. This affiliation proved to be a wise and providential decision. In 5 years, 50 novices joined the congregation. But the sisters' faith would be put to the test. At the turn of the 20th century, a new revolution in France began to enforce a violent separation between church and state. As a result of the laws of 1901, thousands of religious schools were closed. Religious orders were forbidden to teach. Congregations were dissolved, and an estimated 50,000 priests and religious were exiled. Yet even in the midst of this most anti-clerical period in modern history to date, St. Dominic was keeping watch over the youngest of his children. The mothers of our congregation were faced with a grave dilemma. They had to choose either exile or secularization. They had either to give up their habit or leave France and give up forming the future generations of Catholic women. At this very critical moment, their doubts and fears were allayed by none other than St. Pius X himself. After sharing their predicament with the Pope, the mothers received this response, which Pius X addressed directly to our congregation. The souls of the children of France are well worth the heroic sacrifices made on their behalf. Accordingly, the mothers chose to don a simple black dress in order to continue their mission of educating the souls of these young children. The 83-year-old Mother General found herself thrown out of her convent after 66 years of religious life. It is said that there were 2 or 3 minutes of sobbing. Then she suddenly stopped and with perfect composure said, "No, my children are homeless. I am their mother. I don't have the right to think about myself." It is this ideal, a real concern for the faith of the children, fidelity to the constitutions of the congregation, and the desire to remain daughters of the Church, which will give the congregation its apostolic orientation in the years to come. These 3 aspects of the spirit of the congregation were at the heart of the battles and debates in the next decades, from the congregation's peak in the 1950s until the most recent miracle, that of the fight for fidelity to tradition, carried out from 1975 to our own day. Under the pontificate of Pope Pius XII and the careful direction of the Dominican priest, Father Roger Thomas Calmel, and the Mother General, Mother Helen Jamet, the constitutions were revised to unify the religious life and teaching life of the sisters and to affirm their mission. Such a reform was pure providence, for it provided a strength and resilience that prepared the congregation unknowingly to withstand the radical changes that would occur in the 1960s and 70s and allow it to survive and to flourish in the aftermath of the revolution of the Second Vatican Council. On October 28, 1965, the decree Perfecte Caritatis of the Second Vatican Council was published with the aim of promoting a renovation and adaptation of religious life, but in conformity to the documents of the Council. In 1954, in a way, the congregation had already carried out its aggiornamento. Did their barely completed reform need to be reformed? One Mother General would answer this question definitively. Even though our congregation was experiencing turmoil due to the Council, almost miraculously, Mother Anne-Marie Simonin was elected Mother General. It was a real surprise, for she had not yet attained the canonical age required for this position. Despite this, the Pope granted a dispensation and allowed her to lead the congregation from 1967 to 1974. Mother Anne-Marie possessed the kind of fiery character needed to navigate the congregation through the post-conciliar storms. She fought hard against the proposed reforms which sought to chip away at their religious and teaching life, such as the imposition of new catechisms, the Mass in the vernacular, and coeducation. And she also fought against the bishops who promoted these reforms. One of her letters addressed to Monseigneur Barthes, Archbishop of Toulouse, evokes this fight. "When we appear before the Lord, I will have to answer only for myself, for my government during this torn and heartrending time, and for the service to the souls of the children who have been entrusted to us. If I were to answer that I voluntarily sacrificed the souls of children only out of obedience to such and such a diocesan director, I will not be less guilty, and nothing and no one will come to my aid to justify my complicity. Despite everything that separates us, I repeat to you, Your Excellency, my desire to serve only Jesus Christ, even in your diocese." Mother Anne-Marie's resistance and frankness did not win her many friends in high religious circles. Repudiated by the Archbishop of Toulouse, she was deposed from her position as Superior General at Pentecost, 1974. Mother submitted humbly but sadly, knowing how the faith and obedience of her sisters would be tested by this trial. She wrote to her Archbishop, "My confidence in the Holy See has not been shaken by this sentence. I am a daughter of the Church and wish to remain so. But I also know that the Tridentine Missal promulgated by the bull Quo Primum by St. Pius V, which I have read and reread, cannot be abolished." At this moment, some sisters made the decision to leave the congregation to begin anew in Brignoles, France. Mother Anne-Marie attempted to hold out a little longer and try both to obey the directives of her bishop and to preserve her faith and her religious life in its entirety. but the two proved to be irreconcilable. Abandoned by their own, in 1975, a heartbroken group of 19 sisters, which included the former Mother General, the Mistress of Novices, a prioress, several professed sisters, Mother Gabriel of the Sacred Heart, the founders of St. Dominic's School being one of them, a few novices and even postulants left Toulouse to continue their religious life in the tiny village of Fonzio. But isn't it a sign of God's providence and evidence of another miracle that God directed this group of sisters without any refuge to the cradle of the Dominican order, to the very city where St. Dominic founded his first convent in 1206? A few books, the clothes on their back, and no money. These were all the mother's possessions as they took a leap of faith into the school year of 1975-1976. A few faithful families who shared the same convictions confided their daughters to them in very difficult circumstances and very real poverty. But it did not take long for families across Europe to learn of this modest school where the Latin Mass, the Catechism, Catholic education, and a Catholic way of life were honored and preserved. More and more students arrived. Families began to move to the region where a boys' school was also being set up nearby. Vocations abounded. A second house was founded in 1982, a third in 1983, then a fourth and a fifth. The fact that we are not defended by our natural leaders, bishops, and others should not discourage us, Mother Anne-Marie wrote to parents, and must not shatter our ardor and our zeal. The conditions in which the Lord asks you and asks us to hold out are heroic, but with his grace, we can withstand the enemy. Mother Anne-Marie was not completely alone in her years of trial. Help came in the person of the Reverend Father de Chivray, a true son of St. Dominic, who, like Father Calmel before him, continued to form the sisters in the spirit of their founder. She also found support in the person of Archbishop Lefebvre, engaged in the same combat, who had also just proclaimed his adherence to the Church of all time and his refusal of the conciliar reforms. He, in turn, found in Mother Anne-Marie a staunch and vocal supporter who encouraged him in his fidelity to the truth and in his work of the restoration of the priesthood. Monsignor Lefebvre is quoted as having said that there were only two men left at that time in southern France: Dom Gérard, the founder of the Benedictine Abbey in Le Barroux, and Mother Anne-Marie. After the Episcopal consecrations in 1988, and after Dom Gérard went his separate way, His Excellency said that there was only one man left, Mother Anne-Marie. And here we can start to see where the two parallel courses of the faithful in France and the faithful in the United States begin to converge. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States in the 1970s, Catholics everywhere were seeking out priests who would provide the traditional sacraments and teach the catechism of their childhood. They heard of the work of Archbishop Lefebvre and cried for his help, as we saw in the beautiful history of Immaculate Conception Church this morning. These families, whose children understood the value of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, of their faith, of a Catholic education because of the sacrifices their parents were making in order to obtain them, these families gave the first vocations to the traditional movement in the United States. Daughters of the pioneers of tradition in the U.S. courageously answered their vocations and left their country to join the Dominicans in Fonzio, not knowing if they would ever return. But as more and more Americans arrived in France, it became clear that the terrain of the New World was ready for cultivation. It was Archbishop Lefebvre this time who came to Mother Anne-Marie. There are so many schools in Europe, but in the United States, they have none. If you found a house in the United States, you will have vocations. Souls were in need. That was all the invitation that Mother needed. The mothers pulled out a map of the United States to see where they should go in this immense country. They decided it was perhaps best to see for themselves. In 1988, two sisters came to the United States to look at the prospective places to set up a school, one American and one French non-English speaker who had volunteered to head up their sixth house and first foundation outside of France, Mother Gabriel of the Sacred Heart. After this initial visit, they returned to the United States in 1990 and gave presentations about the congregation to society chapels in Chicago, Kansas City, St. Mary's, California, and Richfield. It was then that the district superior of the society, Father Peter Scott, recommended that the sisters go to Post Falls, Idaho. Here, there was already a substantial traditionalist community. Their boys' school already had over 50 students. He promised to find somewhere for them to live. And so it was that on August 7th, 1991, 7 Dominicans left France and settled on West Riverview Drive to bring the light of truth to the children of the United States. Awaiting them was a small greenhouse, a barn, a boat garage, 20 acres thickly covered in pine trees, not much water, and about 50 girls ready to begin classes in a month. Those first years of St. Dominic's School resembled so much the first years in Fonzio. There were the physical difficulties to face, of course, and also the challenges of beginning from scratch. Yet in those pioneer days, for every hardship, there was an equally beautiful example of courage, generosity, and of great faith. How many generous families opened their homes to the sisters to give them water, to lend them their showers, to provide a place for the boarders to sleep. How many kind souls stopped by to offer their help, food, or household items to furnish the sisters' convent. How many benefactors sustained them with their donations. Little did they know that they were at times the direct instruments of divine providence in very subtle and sometimes in blatantly evident ways. And just to give you some examples of a few miracles of the early days, well, you already know the spoon story from Sister Mary Jordan. And another day, the sisters realized they would be needing a photocopier to get ready for school. But they didn't tell anyone about their plight. The very same day, a photocopy machine arrives mysteriously at their doorstep. $50,000 was urgently needed for a sprinkler system. The next day, a check for the exact amount arrives in the mail. At one point, only $1,000 remained in their bank account, and it seemed that all the current building on the property would have to be put on hold mid-project. When asked if the workers should be sent home until the funds could be obtained, Mother simply answered, "No, this is God's project. He will take care of it." The very next day, 2 generous benefactors pledged $200,000. Without these families, these benefactors, God knows that we would not be here today, and we know that they will not go unrewarded. Part of the beginning from scratch was designing the look of the property once the sisters had decided that they would remain here and build. As Mr. Stromberg, Mr. Swatzow, Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Roman, Mr. Barb, and so many others, I'm sure, can attest, Mother Gabriel of the Sacred Heart is a woman with a vision. Thinking they were being helpful by proposing to Mother a ready-made plan of the future school building, a building that was practical and functional, they were met with a very quick, "Oh no, that will not do." And over the next few years, the faithful artists, architects, carpenters, and builders of the first hour worked side by side with her to design and realize buildings that would create a harmonious ensemble that would blend in with their surroundings by using wood cut down from the property, that would last and that were beautiful. Even the colors of the walls and the wood inside were chosen to create an atmosphere conducive to study and to prayer. It was a true apostolate of beauty, and being surrounded by beauty is perhaps one of the most powerful ways that a student's taste is formed at St. Dominic's School. The shell of the chapel was constructed to house classrooms as the main school building was going up, while everyone attended Mass temporarily in the Barn Cathedral, as it was affectionately called. When the school was completed in 1995, the overpopulated greenhouse breathed a sigh of relief as everyone moved up the hill, rejoicing over their new classrooms, dormitories, staircases, and kitchen. Just 1 year later, the chapel was completed, and the altar was consecrated in a solemn and splendid 5-hour ceremony. Over the next 5 years, stained glass windows depicting the life of St. Dominic were designed by one of the sisters, crafted by a local artisan, and funded little by little by classes and benefactors. Meanwhile, the former temporary chapel became the music building for piano and violin lessons. The original greenhouse was transferred to the use of our teachers, and the boat garage was converted into a guest house. It became clear that after only a few years, the cafeteria and its little stage would not be sufficient for school plays and functions, and so in 2000, the auditorium building was constructed. To these would be added a garage, a pavilion, a cemetery, and in 2012, St. Bernadette School for our little ones. Especially in the early days, the sisters participated in the work of these projects as much as they could and enlisted their students as well. Many a recess was spent scraping tar from hardwood tiles that had been recuperated for the hallways, or moving chairs, desks, and piles of books from one end of the property to the other. It was normal, it was expected that the girls participate in the work, and the pioneer spirit of the mothers was infectious. We students didn't expect things to be perfect. We accepted that sometimes we had to go without. We were grateful for what we had, and we took care of it. Deeply ingrained within us, without our even knowing perhaps, was a real sense of the virtue of poverty, of gratitude, and a spirit of sacrifice. Harder than the physical obstacles, no doubt, were the challenges of educating an entire generation of youth, and not only the children, but their parents too. Mother Gabriel saw to the latter by giving regular parents' meetings that covered topics from principles of education and a right understanding of feminine nature to the congregation's method of teaching and a choice of subjects. The task of cultivating the children in front of them was a daily work in progress, which the sisters undertook with great enthusiasm and ingenuity. They knew that the church had entrusted to them the mission of forming the women of tomorrow, women who are profoundly Catholic, strong in their faith, with an interior life, with convictions, who are able to reflect and to judge by the light of true principles. But it was not only through catechism lessons that the sisters were going to transform their students. They were forming cultivated young ladies with a real life of the mind, whose natural life was sanctified by faith, and who would one day be capable of giving to others what they themselves had received. Learning how to think and to judge through philosophy, literature, languages, and history. Learning how to pray through singing Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. Learning to love the church through living the rhythm of the liturgical year. Everything was slowly but deeply transforming their minds, hearts, and souls, and giving them, as our constitutions say, the necessary arms to avoid the snares of the world and to cooperate as women in the building of a Christian order. And with the transformation of the students, one often witnessed the transformation of entire families along with them. One 10-year-old came home recounting something new she had learned in class that day. Not very convinced, her mother dismissed this new idea with, "Oh, those are just the ideas of the mothers." To which the very serious little girl responded, "No, Mom, that's not just the mother's opinion, it's the truth." The same phenomenon that occurred in those first years in Fonzio began to happen in Post Falls. Families flocked to Post Falls to benefit from the education offered there. Encouraged by the priests of the society to make the sacrifice of moving or of sending their daughters away to board, these courageous parents made the conscious decision to put the education of their children first. They left well-paying jobs, their homes, family, and friends to put down roots in northern Idaho because they knew the value of what their children would be receiving. Enrollment at St. Dominic's, like that of Immaculate Conception Academy, doubled the second year, and then doubled again and again. From 35 students, St. Dominic's has grown to 200 students, and this past June we watched our 25th graduating class walk across the stage. From one small greenhouse in the Northwest, our congregation now has 3 schools in the United States. From 19 sisters in Fonzio, our congregation now numbers over 250 sisters, 2,500 students, and 20 schools in 4 countries. Our congregation's American contingent has grown to nearly 50 vocations, 19 of whom are graduates of our schools. In 3 years, the congregation of the Holy Name of Jesus will celebrate its 50th anniversary, an anniversary that marks not its original foundation, but its preservation and renewal. As we celebrate together the 50 years of Post Falls, how can we not see the hand of divine providence? It would be impossible to thank all those who have contributed to this fight, to this renewal during the 31 years of the existence of St. Dominic School. And surely if I attempted, I would inadvertently leave out even more. Our best thanks is to follow the example of those who came before us, to continue to fight and to build, and to keep alive that pioneer spirit that trusts in God and takes nothing for granted. The fight that Mother Anne Marie led to the end, the fight that you, your parents, or your grandparents led, is far from over. In these times when a new revolution is shaking the church and the world, it will be up to the next generation to pick up the pieces, continue on, and faithfully hand down what they have received. It is the fight that you, dear students, have not yet led because others have done so in your place until now. At the dawn of all the battles that still awaits, the message these past 50 years of history have left you is that the truth will set you free. As the Archbishop's own teacher, Father Le Floch, said, "The certainty of being in the truth is the supreme strength. With it, we can bear all things." To all those souls who have done so courageously, thank you.
Thank you again, Mother Marie Sabina and Mrs. Catherine Souza, for those talks. Definitely appreciated. We are going to take just a very short break before we move on to the next presentation, 1 to 2 minutes max. For those on the live stream, it will not switch to another channel. It's going to stay on this same YouTube link for the next presentation as well. So thank you. Just a quick 2-3 minute break, and then we will move on to the next presentation. Thank you. Has taught history for more than a decade at Immaculate Conception Academy. The author of The Wilderness Cathedral, an extensive history of the Catholic Church in the Northwest, and as well as the Immaculate Conception Church 50th Jubilee commemorative book. If you haven't seen that, there's a table set up with that book towards the entrance, the middle entrance there. With that, I'd like to welcome Jacob Eberlein.
Thank you, Ethan. "40 years ago, a young mother and father drove 3 hours to visit Father Debashir at his home basement chapel to have their second son baptized. He had already presided over their wedding 4 years before, had baptized their firstborn son, and he was happy to bring this new baby into the fold of the church. And 40 years later, I am humbled and honored to stand here today to tell you about the man, the priest who baptized me and who founded Immaculate Conception Church. The celebration of 50 years gives the opportunity for newcomers to connect with the founders and to discover, if they have not already, how their church came into being. The Jubilee of Immaculate Conception Church, therefore, is a moment in time that brings to the forefront what really binds us to a mutual purpose: Catholic tradition, the Latin Mass, or simply put, the faith. ICC is the second largest parish of the Society's U.S. district, but with all of this busyness going on in the community, it is difficult to believe that it was once a tiny parish. It was dedicated in 1972, but its origins go further back. It is simply a continuation of Catholicism as it was practiced prior to the Second Vatican Council. In an organic way, ICC brings to us today what was lost to so many parishes in the 1960s and 70s. Dr. Ranowski has done an excellent job of explaining to us what it was like before that. Post Falls received its first resident Catholic priest in 1917. And in 1926, they built a little church called St. George's. It was a small but neat country church and thrived over the following decades. But in the 1960s, signs of modernization in the spirit of Vatican II were apparent in the parish there, as well as St. Thomas Church in Coeur d'Alene. There was, however, one redemptorist priest who would not go along with the novelties, and this was Father George Catherine. And by the time he was transferred in 1968, more people attended his side altar Latin Mass than were attending the English Mass on the high altar. If you would like to learn a little more about Father Catherine, you should read Father Alphonse's new book published by the Angelus Press. And if you would like to learn more about the Blue Army, Francis Schuchart, and Sedevacantism, or other details of ICC history, my little book is over there. So after Father Catherine left, the faithful who wanted the Tridentine Mass, but who would not go along with Schuchart, were left with very few choices. In 1969, these concerned individuals began to hear about an old retired Canadian priest living in Spokane Valley, Washington, who was saying the Latin Mass in his office-turned-chapel. This priest was Father Edward Debashir, who was born in 1902 in Belgium, only 24 miles from the city in France where Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was born 3 years later. When the two met later in life, they enjoyed speaking French and reminiscing of a similar childhood memories. This affinity brought them closer together in a closer friendship as they collaborated to preserve Catholic tradition. As Father Debashir later said, "I think we have a little bit of the same blood in us. He was brought up not far from Belgium, you see. Look out, they are tough." Father Debashire's family moved to Canada in 1909, and he grew up in Forget, Saskatchewan. He worked on the family farm and spent his spare time riding horses, hunting animals, and playing his favorite sport, hockey. The priests there were missionaries of La Salette, and when he grew up, he too became a La Salette father, being ordained a priest May 21st, 1930. He was a missionary in Saskatchewan and Alberta for several years until World War II, when he became a military chaplain and served in Europe for the Canadian Armed Forces for 4 years. Now, on one occasion, Father Debusschere was at the front lines when a fallen German soldier called for him. The man thought he was dying, and he asked for the sacraments. Afterwards, he asked the priest's name so that he could remember the person who had helped an enemy soldier. In the end, the soldier lived, and after the war, he invited Father to come to Germany so that he could thank him again and so that Father could meet his family. Back home in Canada, Father Debusschere spent about 8 years at various parishes in Alberta. But then there was something that made him ask his bishop for retirement. It took some convincing to get his bishop to release him, and also for the Bishop of Spokane to accept him into his diocese. And at one point, the new bishop in Spokane asked him about his money situation. And Father Debusschere replied with the following words: "Well, I have my own money. Because when I was in Canada, Your Excellency, I traded in the wheat futures market. And when the wheat futures got up as high as I thought they could, I got nervous and I called my broker and told him to sell out." Father then bought a house on Bowdish Road in Spokane Valley in 1953. He became semi-retired, helping out with various parishes as needed as an assistant priest. His first assignment was in Ritzville, Washington, which isn't far from here, it's just south, where he filled in for the pastor who went on vacation. And it was there he met Ray and Pearl Saleri, who would continue to be lifelong friends. Ray and Father's mutual ability to speak French sealed the friendship, and in the years that followed, Father Debusschere helped in various local parishes such as St. John Vianney in Spokane and St. Joseph's, where many of ICC's own parishioners are buried today. Father became a little more retired in 1959. He spent time fishing and relaxing, with a cigar in one hand, a glass of port wine in the other, and his trusty Cocker Spaniel dog nearby. From time to time, the Saleri family would come to visit, and sometimes for Sunday brunch. One thing they noticed, though, that his retirement was often interrupted by people coming by at odd times for spiritual direction and confession. Well, retirement was going well until the modernization in the Church, Vatican II, brought its many changes to the Diocese of Spokane. At first, Father adopted the English in the Mass up to the canon and then continued on the rest in Latin. But at some point, by 1969, he realized what was happening, and he returned to the full Tridentine Mass, never looking back. As Father Couture said of ICC's founding priest earlier today, it all began with the love of an old priest for the true Mass, the Mass of his ordination, and his decision to stick to it. In the same year, a Spokane Valley parishioner, who is with us today, Janet Carstetter, was surprised to meet Father at a nearby church while he was offering the Latin Mass. Also weary of the changes, she began to attend his Mass whenever she could, and when the bishop finally told Father Debusschere to stop doing so, he moved the Mass to a parishioner's home, and then shortly after this to his own home on Bowdish Road. Around this time, John and Bernice O'Neill began attending Mass there. At first, there were only 4 people attending his Mass, but news traveled quickly. And within a few months, he moved his chapel from upstairs into his basement living room. Now, being a bit of a perfectionist, it is not surprising that he made it a proper place for the liturgy, naming it St. Pius V Chapel. The walls were paneled wood, and there was a simple altar with images of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the Sacred Heart of Jesus hanging over it. There was a proper communion rail, and stations of the cross adorned the walls. There was even a stained glass window on the left side of the room. Now, who has a stained glass window in their basement? Except maybe in the 70s, not sure. By 1971, there were about 40 people attending Mass there. That year, the Diocese of Spokane remodeled the cathedral and to bring it into conformity with the liturgy of Vatican II, and they sold the former pews at auction. The people attending Father Debashire's Mass seized the opportunity, and they purchased these for their little basement chapel. Pearl Solari once recalled that Father always wanted things just right and to be the best they could be. But she adds the following words. This was from my interview with her. If he thought there was going to be any deviation from that, boy, he was going to let you know. It was this tendency, though, that helped to ensure that there would be a parish left for his flock to continue attending the Latin Mass after he passed. For this, he was much loved. Parishioners affectionately referred to him as Father D, Father Deb, or Father Butch. Mike Swatsell tells us that Father emphasized having a good family life and praying the daily rosary. John O'Neill recalled that he was an unusual person, and he adds that, with these words, he wasn't eloquent in his speaking, but he was very profound in his statements, end quote. Despite this, Father almost never missed the opportunity to weave hockey into his sermons somehow. Being from Canada, it came naturally. And when asked how he responded to the changes in Vatican II, he would say, I told them to go to Honolulu. And it's not too difficult to understand what he meant. His Cocker Spaniel dog, Goldie, was always at his side, at home, in the car, at dinner at other people's homes, where Father would make sure that the dog received a plate of food on the floor. Father was very grateful for everything. He was very patient with children and enjoyed speaking with them. He was kind and generous despite being tough. It would be difficult to discover the many times he gave out of charity, aside from the donation of his time in preserving the Latin Mass for us today. Throughout his time as pastor at Post Falls, he donated thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, to various projects, and he gifted the church $10,000 in his will. Father Debashire loved to sing, and he was good at it, as you heard earlier today. One time, on visiting his hometown in Canada, he was given an honor by the church where he was educated, and they asked him to say a few words. And he obliged, being loud enough to be heard without any amplification. Then he announced he was going to sing for them and said these following words, you probably think I need an accompaniment. Well, for your information, I do not need an accompaniment, because if that organist hits the wrong note, it's going to throw me clear off. He couldn't help to make a joke. In 1969, some people from North Idaho, including a young man, Father Gregory Post, began attending Father Debashire's Mass. Post had already studied for the priesthood and had been a Carmelite until the changes of the 1960s forced him to leave. He served Mass for Father Debashire until departing in 1971 for the Society of St. Pius X Seminary in Econ, Switzerland, to complete his training under Archbishop Lefebvre. In a short year, the Archbishop ordained him in the summer of 72 at the Shrine of Our Lady of the Prairies in Powers Lake, North Dakota. This is the first American priest of the SSPX and is also the first vocation connected with Father Debashire's flock here. And ICC counts him as one of our own. Father Post celebrated his Golden Jubilee as a priest this year on August 28th and is with us here today, and we are very, very pleased to have him with us today. Thank you. Now, if you get a chance to sightsee around the area, you'll notice there are a lot of trees in the Northwest. We harvest trees, we send them to sawmills. So sawmills are an important part of the economy. The city of Post Falls was named after Frederick Post, no relation to Father Post, who came here, Frederick Post came here in 1871. He built a dam across the river. He opened a sawmill only a few hundred yards from where we are now in this room. So the city owes a great deal of its beginnings to a sawmill owner. Coincidentally, providentially, Immaculate Conception Church owes some of its beginnings to another sawmill owner of Post Falls, Leonard Malloy. He and his wife Jewel were attending Mass in Father Debashire's basement and were friends with the O'Neills. In fact, Leonard and John had a lot in common. John was also a successful businessman, owning several laundromat buildings in the area, and at the time he also owned what is now the Post Falls Museum. Leonard owned the Idaho Veneer Company, which was established in 1953 as a joint family venture, and it included a large swath of land in the middle of Post Falls. It was probably the largest business at the time in Post Falls. These businessmen came from different backgrounds, but they shared a noble professionalism and a shrewd business sense. It was their honesty, their professionalism, their sense of duty, and above all, their deep Catholic faith that ensured that the financial and secular aspects of the early parish would carry on so smoothly. Catherine has already described to you how Father Debashire's little basement chapel was moved to Post Falls and how Leonard and John worked together to purchase it in 1972. But the circumstances were truly providential. And I'd like to underline this. In 1964, the Idaho Department of Highways announced that it would build the Interstate 90 straight through the heart of Post Falls, right through the very city block where St. George's Church stood, forcing the Catholic parish there to reach a settlement with the state, who bought them out. The pastor lived there until September 2nd, only days before September 6th, when John O'Neill purchased the church. And it was only 3 city blocks from where the current ICC stands today. So after the move, the parishioners, they formally elected a board of trustees or directors, and they began the process of establishing a nonprofit corporation under which the church could operate. They elected John O'Neill as president, Leonard Malloy as vice president, Richard Guilfoyle as secretary-treasurer, and Bob Klotz and Jack Booth as directors of the new organization they called Parents for a Moral Society. They did this with the support of Father Debashire, who was happy to let them take care of the business while he said Mass. Now, Providence selected a very talented group of men for this job, as they provided sound leadership, operating the church transparently, which is very important for an organization like this, especially in its beginnings, because if you have scandals or something, usually the organization kind of falls apart. But in Post Falls, we were very blessed to have never had something like that happen, and God chose amazing people to lead us in the very beginning, from the very beginning. They might not have made the best decisions all the time, but we may excuse them considering the unprecedented times that they lived in. By 1974, there were about 60 families, with a total of 300 people attending Mass at ICC. The church only held about 150 people, though this made it necessary for Father to say 2 masses every Sunday. But he was retired, so he said daily mass at his home. He had retired more than 20 years before. But now he started to get serious about the idea. He supported the work of Archbishop Lefebvre, and he wanted a society priest to take over for him. Yet, when he wrote to Icône with his request in 1974, he received the following response, quote, "If you ask the Lord to leave you there yet for several years, I don't think there will be any difficulty." End quote. Not very encouraging. The 1970s were filled with milestones for the Society of St. Pius X in America. In the same year that Father Post was ordained, Father Clarence Kelly came to Long Island, New York, and established the first chapel there. In 1973, a seminary was founded in Michigan. In 1974, the district headquarters was established in Oyster Bay, New York, under Father Kelly, and in the same year, Father Post received his first U.S. assignment in Campbell, California. The first installment of the Angelus magazine arrived in 1978, and in that year, the Society also purchased the large Jesuit campus in St. Mary's, Kansas, which today is the Society's largest parish and school in the United States. Okay, back to Post Falls. So in 1975, the number of families attending ICC increased by 15%, and their numerous children attended local public schools or parochial schools or were homeschooled. And it was that summer that Peggy Booth approached Judy Brooks, suggesting that they should start a parish academy. Father Debashir agreed, and Immaculate Conception Academy opened its doors in September 1975. There were only 17 students in that first year of ICA, and tuition was only $35 per month per family. If only Father Luke could price match today. The two mothers did their best teaching boys and girls K through 6, using a mix of outdated Catholic textbooks and some Protestant textbooks that were needed. They also had the help of Miss Rita Holland, an ex-nun who had left her order because of the changes at the time. They completed their first year of classes with only a few complaints from parents about the Protestant textbooks. Now, there were many new parishioners around this time at ICC who came because they had decided to leave Schuckart's Sedevacantist group, which he called the Tridentine Rite Catholic Church. This new surge of parishioners meant more students for the school. Many parents, however, were very vocal about getting qualified teachers and modern textbooks for the school. They also wanted a high school. So in December of 1976, they achieved a dramatic policy change. The original school directors and teachers either resigned or were asked to resign, and they were all replaced. Several families pulled out of the school, and Mrs. Brooks went on to lead a homeschool group with the help of Mrs. Marianne Henry, who had joined in teaching at the academy that year. Now, just to go ahead a little bit, the new teachers, however, they resigned in the early 1980s to join Father Fenton's new group in Colorado. So the first SSPX pastor of Post Falls, Father Laudenschlager, had a school with no teachers. So he turned to someone with experience. He asked Mrs. Brooks to come back to the academy to teach and also to head the school. Back to 76. Father Debashir announced his retirement again. The only problem, there was no priest to take his place. And reading the old trustee notes are hilarious because they literally say, oh, Father Debashir announced his retirement again. It's like it's always happening. The trustees wrote to Father Snyder and Icône for help, but he could only reply with the advice to beg Father Debashir just to keep on going. More importantly, as Catherine mentioned earlier, he rather discreetly he suggested to regularly stay in contact with the Archbishop to keep Post Falls at the forefront of his mind. And this was exactly what John O'Neill did. As Catherine has explained to us, it was especially to John O'Neill's persistence that Archbishop Lefebvre came to Post Falls. This out-of-the-way town, which is hardly on the map, and how lucky it seemed that the Archbishop would even go there, especially considering that many Americans do not even know where Idaho is, except that it's somewhere in the Midwest. To their credit, most Americans know that potatoes come from Idaho. Now, there was a sense of urgency when Father Debashire tried to retire again in 1977. The trustees asked Father Catherine to come to Post Falls and take over, but he politely declined due to overwork. But he gave them these following encouraging words. He said, quote, "I hope and pray that Father Debashire will be able to continue to serve you as he has done so well and kindly, and that divine providence will also provide a priest to take care of all the good people of the area," end quote. In the meantime, the number of parishioners increased and their relationship with the SSPX deepened. The trustees now discussed the possibility of formally joining the society and transferring the church over to the Archbishop. This led to arguments and fragmentation within the parish, with many wanting to join the Society of St. Pius X and others wishing to remain independent, while others wanted to become sedevacantists, and others were just simply concerned that the Archbishop could somehow lose the church to a breakaway priest. And as this future proved, this was a legitimate concern. Not our future, luckily. Now, O'Neill and Malloy supported joining the society and transferring the church to the organization. Father Debashire wasn't getting any younger, and they knew that they needed to find a priest for Post Falls. On December 8th, 1978, the parish held a contentious meeting in the church basement to vote on the future of ICC. The arguments lasted for hours, but still no one could agree. But they did agree to postpone for 10 days until Father Kelly, the U.S. Superior, could come. Meanwhile, Dean Gray, a teacher at the school, collected proxy votes from the mission chapels because they too would be affected by such a change. And my grandfather and grandmother were some of these people. But the momentous day came on December 18th, when the group of people from ICC grilled Father Kelly with questions. And they hovered around topics such as, who would own the parish? Would Father Debashire be taken care of? What was the Archbishop's relationship with Rome? Was there any chance that ICC could be taken from the Archbishop? This meeting lasted for more than 2 hours before the vote finally came in. 77% in favor and 23% against. Now, everyone assumed that Post Falls would get a new priest right away upon joining the society, but this just did not happen. There were still too few society priests to go around, but Archbishop Lefebvre did promise to send one eventually. As if for reassurance, he did come to Post Falls in 1980 to be present for Father Debashire's Golden Jubilee commemorating 50 years as a priest. Now, in the 1980s, Father Debashire did begin to slow down. He was nearing 80 years old, had been retired for 30 years, plus he had been unretired for more than a decade. Starting a parish from his basement was not part of the retirement plan. Finally, in 1982, the Archbishop sent Father Douglas Laudenschlager to take over as resident pastor of ICC. Within a year of his arrival, the parish was back to its all-time high of about 300 parishioners. Many of those who left returned, and others who had just discovered the Latin Mass brought new faces. Father Couture has already shared with you his stories of his time in Post Falls, describing the magnitude of work done by the priests of ICC. In 1987, Father John Rizzo replaced him as pastor. And in 1988, Father Christopher Hunter replaced Father Ranger as assistant priest. At that time, the numbers attending Mass made it difficult to fit into that tiny church. People were literally standing outside on the steps during Mass. And so, Father Rizzo spoke with Marty Brooks about taking on a new building project, a new church for ICC. The planning committee met on the first day of the following year, and Father Todd Angeli came as a third priest that year to help the ever-growing parish. The planning continued until mid-1991, when finally the crew of hardworking volunteers moved all of the interior items out of the little ICC church to the church hall, which became the temporary chapel. And today this is the where the school offices are, but it was an open space upstairs back then. And on June 14th, 1991, the old ICC once again drove down the streets to land on the Idaho Veneer property, with hopes that someone would purchase it. Now, the parishioners were filled with excitement, but while the old ICC was being moved and its foundation demolished, the founding priest, Father Debashir, breathed his last, passing away at 88 years old on June 21st, 1991. Father Deb wished to be buried at ICC so that the school children there would not forget to pray for his soul. Of course, this wasn't possible, but he is buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery. So if you ever get a chance to drive over there and pray for his soul, please do. It's only a 17-minute drive from ICC. Also in 1991 came the foundation of the Carmel of the Holy Trinity Carmelite Convent in Spokane, as well as the establishment of St. Dominic Girls' School in Post Falls by our dear Dominican sisters from Fonzio, France. Bishop Williamson came from his post at the seminary in Winona, Minnesota, to lay the new cornerstone. Father Hunter commented in an interview that this was a source of excitement and inspiration for the parish. Marty Brooks and his crew of workmen spent several months building what would be the first SSPX church built from the ground up in America. They carefully removed the original St. George's stained glass windows to install in the new building to keep something of the original ICC intact. These are the shorter windows in the church. The taller 8 larger stained glass windows are ones that were removed from a church in Chicago. The crew also removed the original 6-foot cross that adorned St. George's, and this is the same cross that you see today on the bell tower of ICC. Now, there was room for nearly 3 times as many people as before. It was also much more decorated than the previous church. Chris Wisniewski, teacher of ICA, quickly became the parish artist and was assisted by Mary Grubar, now Goggin. Father Rizzo wanted the altar to be painted and decorated with gold gilding. Plus, the new church needed side altars, and Joe Grenke, a craftsman from Michigan, built these and assisted in painting as well. Ron Vallone came from Winona, Minnesota, and taught Wisniewski the art of gold gilding. He also painted the beautiful scene of St. John the Baptist and our Lord in the baptistry. No sooner had they finished painting the altars when my mother-in-law, Renee Williams, along with her father, Don Wiley, made a strange discovery in a neighbor's garage in Coeur d'Alene. She looked through a window and saw what she thought might be a podium. So she asked her dad to come look at it with her. And to their surprise, they found that the neighbor had hoarded a rather large item many years before. It was the pulpit of ICC. And you know you're not a hoarder until you get to that level. Now Wisniewski and her team had to get back to work, decorating it with gold gilt. And she told me in a recorded interview that the pulpit had as much work to do on it as the 3 sanctuary altars combined. and I'm sure she was thrilled about the new work. Despite the heavy workload, she stayed on as the parish artist for decades, while completing a record 28 years teaching at ICC before retiring in 2019. In 1991, there were at least 600 people attending the 3 Masses at Immaculate Conception Church on Sundays, making it one of the fastest growing parishes of the society in the U.S. Post Falls serviced 12 mission chapels, and there were about 300 parishioners in the Seattle area, 70 in Alaska, 300 in Oregon, and 100 in Montana. All of these contributed in some way to build a new church in Post Falls. The prayers, the sacrifices, the dedicated work of all of these people are what built the walls of the church. Building was completed just a few days before it was dedicated on March 25th, 1992, this also being the first anniversary of Archbishop Lefebvre's death. In 1992, Father James Doran replaced Father Rizzo as pastor. This new pastor was previously the editor of the Angelus Press and now found himself having to make decisions regarding the final phases of the church construction, especially completing the sanctuary. He also took great interest in the school, remodeling the upper floor parish hall to give it more rooms for classes and offices. He also designed the original school crest, organized the Academy's first annual Cataldo pilgrimage in 1993, and began planning for a new, larger school. In 1993, the Dominicans broke ground on a new church, and in 1994, they started to build their new school building. That year, the Holy Name Society was established with Tim Elo as first president. Father Doran was transferred to the seminary in Winona in 1996, and Father Leo Boyle replaced him. It was he who completed the new high school building in 1998, just months before the first ICA graduation commencement ceremony. And among these first graduates was Father Michael Fortin, who was ordained an SSPX priest in 2009. And it's here where I have to admit that there are mistakes in my book. So in my book, it says that Dr. Tardif graduated in that year, and that's incorrect. And I also made an omission. I'm sorry. The Holy Name Society, I'd meant to put your founding year in there, but somehow I put it in my presentations, and I forgot about it in my book. Sorry. It'll be in the final version. So during his time in Post Falls, Father Boyle built the new priory across the street from the church. This was completed in September 1998, just before he was transferred to his new assignment. Father Paul Morgan was the new pastor. In 2001, Father Morgan organized the first annual Cataldo pilgrimage for the parish. And ICC still makes this pilgrimage every July. And I'd like to add that in doing this, they join the tens of thousands of Catholics who have made the pilgrimage there since the 1800s. Likewise, the Coeur d'Alene Indians make an annual pilgrimage on August 18th, which they have done since 1937. The mission holds great significance for the tribe because they built it in the 1850s under the instructions of Jesuit missionaries. Now let's cover some highlights of the final decades of ICC. Dr. Peter Hojnowski produced the first of many high-quality school plays with the Comedy of Errors in 2001. The Cristeros soccer team was established in 2004. In 2006, the high school started its annual pilgrimage to Rome. And in 2007, Judy Brooks retired from the school, completing 22 dedicated years to Catholic education at ICC, in addition to several years at St. Dominic's School and St. Mary's Academy in Kansas. From a small school of 17 students to nearly 200, she had witnessed a marvelous transformation from her little school, and she once told me the following words: "My goodness, I just cannot believe how much that school has grown. It's just incredible. It's really wonderful to see that you have that many students. It's a blessing." End quote. Father Jacques Emily became pastor in 2003, staying for a brief time, and it was his idea to open a parish girls' school, and he asked Leslie Gonzalez for assistance, and she sought out Miss Miranda Williams, who founded an unofficial school which was formally established only after Father Christian Grange became pastor in 2005. Mrs. Marlene Wiseman became administrator, and both she and Miranda taught in the little school that remained open only for a short time, but resulted in St. Dominic's adding room for more students. A little side note here, I married Miss Williams a couple years later. Father Grange also purchased a large parcel of property just outside the Post Falls city limits, with hopes that the parish could build a larger school and even a church there. Now, don't tell Father Griego, but I've heard that some parishioners refer to this as the $1 million parking lot. But perhaps one day it will be a parking lot filled with cars and a huge new church filled with faithful Catholics. As we all know, ICC is outgrowing its current location. Father Paul Vassal took up where Father Grange left off, becoming pastor in 2011. He worked to bring more teachers with specialized degrees into the school. And in 2014, Father James Carlisle refounded the parish youth group as Exsurge. Father Thomas Hufford brought a new music program into the school around this time, during his time at ICC. And in 2015, the high school choir, under the direction of Father William Kimball, won gold medals and superior rating at the Music Fest Northwest, and they sang live for the local radio. Also in 2015, a middle school history teacher, myself, organized ICA's first participation in the Kootenai County Historic Essay Contest, and that year, Simon Estrada won first place in the middle school division. St. Dominic's School also participated, and Elise Jones won first place in the high school division. There were an impressive number of total graduates around 2016, with more than 125 graduates from ICA and more than 200 from St. Dominic's. That year, St. Dominic Girls' School celebrated its 25th anniversary, and Immaculate Conception Academy had just completed its 40th anniversary. On his first visit to Post Falls in 1976, Archbishop Lefebvre explained the connection between vocations, true Catholic families, and good Catholic schools. Vocations were necessary, but having seminaries was not sufficient because vocations normally come from Catholic families educated by Catholic schools. And you heard his quote earlier today where he says, "We need the schools for the true Catholic education for the children, because we cannot have the true Catholic family if there is not the true Catholic schools." 40 years later, his words seem like prophecy. Many future priests and religious have graduated over the decades as the number of Catholic families in Post Falls have increased. In 2016, Father Stephen McDonald replaced Father Vassal as pastor, but he only stayed for 1 year, with Father Patrick Summers taking charge in 2017. This is the period of time that I call the pastoral revolving door. And after 1 year, the pastor again changed to Father Beck, Gerard Beck, who came in 2018 and remained in Post Falls until 2021 when the current pastor arrived. Today, ICC has around 2,000 parishioners, with nearly 1,500 attending Sunday Mass in Post Falls, about 60 at St. Dominic's, and 120 at the Carmel. In addition to his many responsibilities, Father Griego found himself immediately organizing the milestone 50th anniversary of Immaculate Conception Church. A large number of founders and old-timers of ICC have passed away by these early decades of the 2000s. And we owe our success to their efforts. These countless individuals who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring the parish where it is today. John O'Neill died on June 13th last year. Leonard Malloy followed him on February 13th this year. These two men and their wives who passed before them lived to see a remarkable growth and change from the small parish they had helped to found in the early 1970s. This jubilee that we are gathered here to commemorate is not just the celebration of this parish reaching the venerable age of 50. It is the celebration of Catholic tradition and the preservation of the Latin Mass in Post Falls and surrounding areas of the Northwest. The founders passed on the tradition received by us today, and it was their support for the work of Archbishop Lefebvre that brought the Society of St. Pius X to Post Falls. The founders of Immaculate Conception Church did not see in their actions anything other than preserving the Catholic faith as it always was, with the intent to provide for their children and grandchildren that which they had received from their parents and their pastors. In this, they participated in the preservation of tradition with but a small and dedicated group of Catholics throughout the world. And my friends, we have inherited this gift. Our responsibility is great, but the task is simple. Pass it on to the next generation.